All right, I'm just going to give it one more minute and then we're going to get started. Thanks everyone for waiting and thanks for joining the program. All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this program about diversity in museum volunteers. Before we get started, I just have a quick little spiel, couple housekeeping things to go over, and then we have a poll for you. So if you're here, you probably know about Cultural Connections. Thank you so much for attending this event. Cultural Connections is a nonprofit dedicated to providing affordable professional development and networking opportunities to our Bay Area community of cultural workers. And all of our events and offerings are created and put on by an entirely volunteer board. The vast majority of our budget for speakers and equipment comes from membership. So this is my little plug. Please, if you're not a member already, consider joining. And if you think your entire staff could benefit from an institutional membership, we have resources available for asking your employer to support professional development with Cultural Connections. We have that available on our website, which is cultural-connections.org. And I'm sure we can pop that in the chat. We have one more event happening this season. So if you stay tuned and check our website, the information for that will be coming up shortly. All right. Well, next I want to introduce our fabulous speakers who you'll be hearing from tonight. First, we have Margaret Fernandez, who serves as Director of Special Events, Special Projects, and Volunteers at Historic Oakland Foundation, whose mission is to preserve, restore, enhance, and share the Historic Oakland Cemetery in partnership with the City of Atlanta. In this position, she oversees the Oakland Cemetery's large-scale programming and manages over 300 active volunteers. She's been involved in museum work, the arts, and nonprofit organizations for over a decade, with a professional emphasis on BIPOC representation at historic sites. She received her master's degree in Latin American art history from Rutgers, and she holds a position of Southeastern Regional Director on the board of the American Association of Museum Volunteers. We also have tonight Kia Hunter, who is the volunteer manager at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. And after more than 2 years in development, the Spy Museum reopened in 2019, and Kia was asked to develop and implement the nonprofit's first volunteer program to coincide with the museum's expanded vision. Her program's mission is to provide critical support to the institution while embracing and representing the local community. This is achieved by rooting the program in diversity, inclusion, and flexible volunteer opportunities. Prior to creating and managing the Spy Museum's volunteer program, Kia served as part of the guest services management team at the 6th Floor Museum in Dallas, Texas. She's also worked for the Smithsonian Institution, Ford's Theater Society, and the Society of the Cincinnati's Anderson House in Development, Education, Special Events, and Volunteer Management. She has a master's degree from George Washington University's Museum Studies program with certificate in nonprofit management and a bachelor's degree in history from Davidson College. So I also want to now pass it over to our two speakers to give a little bit more introduction to themselves and maybe say a few things about what they're thinking of for tonight's program. So I'll hand it over to Mary first.
Thank you so much, Greta. And first of all, I want to preface everything with I'm a little bit sick today. As I joked earlier, I am helping to facilitate a conversation on diversity and volunteers, not on best workplace practices. So bear with me, I'm being propped up by cold medicine right now. So I've been kind of working professionally within the area of representation at historic sites for about a decade. This is something that truly means a lot to me personally. I'm the child of immigrants. I'm married to an immigrant. Having the ability to see yourself in the museum space, I think, is really critical. And of course, a facet of that is being able to see yourself within a diverse staff, within a diverse volunteer corps. So that's something I'm quite passionate about. Within volunteer corps, there's always this question of training and retraining. There's been truly a reckoning within the museum world, an essential, necessary, critical reckoning that has been implemented to various degrees of success in the museum world. And so providing resources for people to kind of understand the direction to head, I think is quite important. Given particularly in our field of volunteer management, there's not always those resources available to us. And Kia can also speak with that. We've worked on this subject quite a bit together.
Great, then let's pass it over to Kia for a bit of an introduction.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me tonight to speak about DAI, something that I will admit is relatively new for me, something that I really started to focus on in the last couple of years when I joined the International Spy Museum, as I was given an incredible opportunity to create a volunteer program from scratch. They did not have volunteers at their old location, and because of that, my recruitment strategies looked a little different than probably most volunteer programs around the country in 2019, in that I didn't have a pool already to draw from, which was a piece of advice I got from a lot of volunteer managers was, oh, I just asked my current volunteers to put out the word. That pretty early on illustrated for me, well, then you're only getting like-minded and sometimes like-looking volunteers. And so I was kind of forced to focus on diversity and inclusion really early on. And I'm really grateful that I got that opportunity because I became very interested in pursuing more equity in the museum volunteer field and spent a lot more time focusing on those topics with the American Association for Museum Volunteers Board, which I'm currently a member of, as well as other organizations and individuals who've been focusing on this work specifically in the museum field. So happy to be here today to talk about my experience and things I've learned along the way.
Thank you so much. We're so excited to have you both here and to hear from you this evening. So before we get into the discussion, we have a quick poll for our attendees, just to get a sense of where everyone is. So that'll pop up on your screen and go ahead and fill that out. We'll just take a minute to let everyone take a look. Okay, we'll just give you another 30 seconds to answer those questions. Okay, great. So I think we probably have our answers in at this point. There we go. So we can take a look at that. Looks like a lot of you have 100 plus volunteers at your institution, that you recruit volunteers annually for the most part, though we have some even more even distribution there. And the vast majority of the volunteers that we have are retired. So that's some good information to start with. All right, well, now armed with that information, we're going to move into our discussion. So the first question that I'd like to pose to our speakers is, what are the most significant barriers that exist for recruiting a diverse volunteer group? And how do you build organizational buy-in for new recruitment strategies? I'll just let either of you jump in.
So I always, preface any conversation about diversity in the volunteer corps in that when people ask that question, how do I make my volunteer corps diverse? I truly think they're asking the wrong question. It's why is my volunteer corps not diverse? And typically that actually comes down to staffing. Is my staff representative of the community that my institution is a part of? Generally, a lot of volunteer recruitment happens from staff accessing their personal circles, and personal circles tend to be fairly homogenous. So if your staff follows along the same kind of demographics that the majority of museums exist within, which is largely white, then that's certainly going to impact who is going to naturally and without intention be coming into your institution as a volunteer, who wants to be recruited, who sees themselves there. And so I think there's a lot of internal questions to ask first before kind of even looking at the diversity of your volunteer corps.
I'll just expand on that a little bit. I think that museums, although we like to think that we are super welcoming and inclusive to everyone, right? Our mission is to educate the public, and the public includes everybody. But there are, I think, a lot of barriers to access just for a visitor that trickle then into volunteerism and are often exacerbated by a lot of the requirements that we request of volunteers, whether that's a certain time commitment, whether that's free labor is the essence of volunteerism, but sometimes we don't provide opportunities for them to even get on site, or provide parking for volunteers, ways for them to even get to our location, and then the amount of time that it might take to volunteer, whether that includes the training in the galleries, and then who's even invited. And Mary already kind of got to that point of we're usually reaching out to the circles that we already know instead of the communities that we are representing. In DC, for example, we have such a diverse community in Washington, D.C. internationally as well. And so for my institution, we have international in the title. It seemed obvious that I had to reach out to the international community, but that wasn't necessarily who we were serving or who our staffing was coming from. So it was an effort that we had to go out and really break down those barriers and invite people to come in and show them what we had to offer.
And as far as leadership buy-in is concerned, I think that more often than not, leadership has buy-in to the extent that they want you to create a diverse volunteer corps. That is probably what 80% of leadership thinks how DEIA should be represented within their volunteer corps, is to the top-down order of, hey, diversify. What leadership needs to be convinced of is providing resources, often monetary resources, because everything requires funding, including supporting your volunteers who give a substantial amount of time and money or money through their time to your institution. So that's where I think the leadership buy-in really, really comes into play.
Yeah,
I think these days there is a lot more, buy-in from leadership, at least in terms of what they say, not necessarily what they do. But historically, that wasn't the case. And so I think that when a lot of volunteer organizations or volunteer corps were created at museums 50, 60 years ago, that wasn't even a consideration, right? If we really acknowledge and reckon with the fact that, white supremacy was a big building block in this country, these organizations, even museums, were not built for these communities. And so when these organizations and when these volunteer programs were created, we were probably purposefully excluding people from participating in volunteerism, specifically in museums. And even if that mindset has changed, those resources have not, which is what Mary was, I think, talking about earlier. And, you can really see what an organization values, where they put their time and where they put their money. And volunteer programs, I think most of us understand that we do not get a huge budget. The idea is that, if there's people are coming in for free, it should be free to organize them and to train them and to recognize them and recruit them, and which we know is not the case.
There was a great line that I recently heard where it was, your budget is a moral document. And I really like that phrasing and how it captures, the importance of having funding and resources behind really anything you pursue as an institution.
Mhm. And to get back, I think, to your initial question, I think we've maybe gone a little bit not off topic, but added to the conversation. How do we get buy-in? And I'm going to steal this actually from Mary, who we were talking about this earlier, is talking about the liability that it creates if you don't do it. And this really resonated with me in convincing leadership that, if we do not do this in the long run or even the short term, it's going to hurt our bottom line, whether that is the educational programs that we create, the exhibits that we offer, the number of visitors who come, and the donors who want to support us. Because if we are not representing the values that we say we represent, people are going to notice and they're going to call us out for that. So the liability there can be really severe if we don't take this seriously and we don't put money towards these issues and really provide a supportive environment for our volunteers and the volunteer managers.
Yeah, I think that's for all the ethical reasons why we want to support diversity, equity, inclusion, and access in your museum, in your volunteer corps, making sure that people of color are represented. There's that kind of practical reason that you can use by framing it in terms of risk in order to get funding and kind of top-down support.
That's great. So you've already touched a little bit on perhaps some strategies for recruitment that are outmoded. Having the existing volunteers, for example, just reach out to their friends. But do you have any examples of maybe some new strategies or different strategies that can be employed more effectively?
Yeah, I can start with some that I've most recently used, coming from having no volunteers at our institution, and getting really creative on how to find people in their communities and to build trust in those communities, and also breaking down barriers to access. So accessibility and equity have become really big pillars for me in order to bring in a diverse volunteer corps. So that includes creating flexible volunteering hours, not just during the workday, right? When only retired people would be able to volunteer, or people who are wealthy enough not to have a job. And so, providing opportunities in the evenings, on the weekends for people to socialize with each other. Also providing flexible training schedules. Also, trainings often have like really strict dates when you have to be on site, making sure that we have both virtual options, recording of our training sessions for people who can't make them because they need childcare or because they are working or they're in class. So having to, now that makes more work for us, but I think the benefits really outweigh that extra effort. We also provide, or in our position descriptions, we spent a lot of time making sure we weren't using language that might turn certain people off, or that was maybe stereotypically, female driven words of like, you have a caring personality, or something like that. To really, make sure that a lot of people saw themselves in the position description that we were using, not having certain requirements, like an educational requirement. Why do you need a college degree in order to volunteer? You don't. So why are we asking for that recommendation or even just previous experience volunteering? I don't need you to have volunteered before. I can teach you all you need to know. So really lowering those requirements to entry as well. That was one thing that we did. And once they are here, creating that inclusive environment for them. We have very clear expectations for our volunteers in terms of the values that they should share with the institution, what we will and will not tolerate in terms of inclusion and equity, which I think we'll get to something we'll talk about a little bit later, of how to deal with volunteers who might not agree with everything that you're doing to help create, you know, a more welcoming environment. So those are some of the basic things that we've done. We also have a couple of neurodiverse volunteers in my program. And so I worked with the Smithsonian to make sure that we were providing enough resources for them to be successful. That included sending out pre-materials for interviews and orientations so that they could prepare for them. Because why do I need a gotcha question for a volunteer interview, or to, you know, keep certain materials secret when they, you know, are going to help somebody in the long run better prepare for the work that they're going to be doing on site.
Yeah, all of the really intentional things that Kia mentioned are so critical. I also would add to that that sometimes diversity has to be the last thing in a chain of events that happens. That the building of an inclusive culture, a culture of belonging, is actually the thing that needs to be focused on first. You do not want a situation in which you have recruited all of these lovely diverse volunteers in terms of neurodivergency, in terms of racial ethnic background, in terms of age, and they come into a toxic environment. You know, inclusion, I have to say, is not only key and kind of builds on recruitment itself, but also makes all of these efforts sustainable and makes people want to come back. I would also add to that the importance of building reciprocal relationships. So this puts a lot of demand on your staff to go outside of their comfort zone and support other institutions, perhaps institutions that focus on the histories of BIPOC individuals, attend their conference, their performance, their lecture, their visit their museum without any expectation of them coming and attending your event. And that's how you build these genuine, sincere relationships, and that's how you expand your circle. And so, yeah, focusing on that culture of inclusion, I think, and focusing on building reciprocal relationships are sometimes things that have to happen first. And depending on your community, maybe diversity is the last thing that happens, and you have to wait for it for a bit.
I love that. That's so helpful. Addressing these deep-seated issues within your institution to move forward is so important. So my next question is, how do you measure whether or not your efforts to increase access are or have been effective? Do you focus on volunteer opinions, guests, both? And what do you look for?
Yes, all of the above. There's certainly no one metric. You know, I always appreciate in I kind of distinguish between volunteer training and volunteer retraining. I've worked both with you know, a new volunteer corps I was able to build up, as well as in a different position, my current position, a very large, very there's got to be a better word than entrenched, but a very established volunteer corps. And so, you know, with new volunteers, yes, there's that question of diversity in numbers, but there's also how are they responding on surveys for how they're feeling within your volunteer corps? Were they welcomed in quickly? Were they brought in quickly and felt like they were part of a community quickly? With existing volunteers, it's always great when you become that person that they can come to and they're like, man, I was watching TV and I heard a term, what does cisgender mean? Can you explain it to me? And that's like maybe not even related to what they do for my organization, but they feel like there is a safe space that they can come, ask questions, and learn. And I'd say that is a success for me.
Yeah, I think that this question can be a little difficult, and that demographics can be easy to measure, but they also can be really problematic, and that people often rely on them to say we've checked a box by, you know, having 10% BIPOC representation, or we have enough people of certain ages volunteering, so we don't need to do anything else. And so I definitely caution everyone against that. I also know from experience that asking volunteers sometimes these very personal questions can feel difficult for our volunteers of, okay, am I just being used for these demographics? Is this all that I am? So it can be difficult. At my institution, any demographics information is optional, which means our data is incomplete. And so, fortunately, we don't have really great reporting like I would want to have. Just as a data nerd, but I think that what Mary's getting at of like, how do people feel is often much more important. And so we do evaluations and ask questions like, yeah, how do you feel when you interact with staff? Or were you able to attend any of the events that, the recognition events that we offered this year? What were your interactions like with other volunteers? Do you have any friends that are volunteers, right? And these kind of get at these bigger questions of, have we created an inclusive environment? Do people feel welcome? Are we creating opportunities for people to engage? And if the responses are only the retired white folks who feel engaged, obviously we're doing something wrong. So I think that those questions are less black and white, but they can provide much more helpful information to guide your program forward. And it also gives them an opportunity to really express, how the program can improve. And sometimes they come up with really great ideas that you didn't think of. So it's, sometimes harder to frame those questions, but I think more important in some respects.
Similarly, yeah, we have the kind of incomplete optional demographic questions and whatnot that we get when someone signs up, of course. I'm pretty sure that my volunteers think that I'm BuzzFeed for all the surveys I send out, except like, spoiler alert, I will not tell you which Harry Potter house you're in. But we do send out kind of quarterly temperature checks, I would say, for how they're feeling, how they're doing. How did that training go? Was there anything that you want us to follow up on?
You've both mentioned retraining a little bit, and I was wondering if you'd ever had an experience where you had returning volunteers who were resistant to retraining or change, and how you may have dealt with some of those willful volunteers.
Yeah, you just got to get real comfortable with firing volunteers. If a volunteer is not on board with the direction of your organization or with your internal culture, like, they can go volunteer somewhere else. They don't have to volunteer with you. There's an institution out there, unfortunately, that probably does match their values, and they can find a new place to volunteer.
I think there's a common misconception that you need to accept every volunteer who offers their time to your organization. And I don't think that's true. And I think many of us know that that's not true, because we do need a certain set of skills for the jobs that we have our volunteers participate in at our organization. We do have certain criteria that needs to be met and a set of values that need to be represented with our course. So I'm very clear in the application that we provide for volunteers, in the interviews that we do with volunteers, and then the onboarding we do with volunteers, that diversity, equity, inclusion, creating a welcoming environment, all of these things are central to our mission. And if you aren't going to serve our mission, then this might not be the best fit for you. And we even have a social media policy for our volunteers, because if they are saying things, even not necessarily representing the institution at the time, that don't fit our values, that's going to create an environment, especially if someone else sees that, online, who is a volunteer, and then has to work with that person the next day. That's not something that we want to deal with. So figuring out, what you will accept and what you won't, and creating that line very, very clearly in your written policies, so that you have something to fall back on when you do have to have these tough conversations with volunteers who, might be resistant to that. And be brave and really stick with the values of the organization. And if the values aren't strong enough, help change them, right? Talk to leadership again, get that buy-in with staff to make sure that there are very clear expectations of, what your organization stands for. And I think as cultural organizations, we have a little bit more of a obligation to do that than maybe a for-profit organization might, where business is the bottom line. If we're here to educate the public, if we're here to serve our local communities, then that needs to be front and center.
And I will say, with a very strong existing volunteer program, it can help if you're doing retraining that's related to diversity, equity, inclusion, access. If you're doing retraining related to updated content that is motivated from that DEIA, from those DEIA principles, it can really help to bring in an outside person, an outside consultant, because oftentimes with a strong established volunteer corps, there's sometimes the perspective of staff come and go, but we stay, we're the constant. Maybe some of y'all have heard that. There can sometimes be the perspective of, well, they have all these plans, but are they really in touch with what's going on in the real world? So bringing in someone who has that kind of expert line on their resume, on their business card, it can sometimes lend credibility to what you're working on with your volunteers. And that's part of where resources come into play, because you need to pay experts for their time and expertise.
Yeah, to build off of that just a little bit, I think bringing in an expert is great, not even just for those retrainings, but even for your to help improve, your program, or help you as a manager. So yeah, bringing in experts, or paying for resources from people who have lived these experiences, right? I am a white woman. I obviously have a very different experience than many of our volunteers, and so I need to make sure that I am learning as much as they are from me, by experts who've spent their lives working on this, or have PhDs on the subject.
And on that note, making sure that your staff gets training if that's within your kind of realm of influence, so that staff members that are working with volunteers have a full understanding of how to create an inclusive environment. So you're, again, not bringing in underrepresented communities into your space and then exposing them to a toxic environment.
That's very helpful. Those approaches to training and retraining. Did you incorporate any new retention initiatives that you feel were reflective of improving diversity in your volunteer crew? Once you have a diverse volunteer group, how can you make sure that you keep them?
That's a great question. I think there are a lot of really good ideas that particularly came out of COVID that have helped us create new ways to think about how people want to engage, and how to create more flexible and inclusive ways to engage, whether that's through virtual programming from home. We created, just like many organizations, right, ways to check in with our volunteers, and for them to socialize from the comfort of their own homes, which is great for people who live farther away, or only have 30 minutes and not 2 hours to engage with you for a program, or for a recognition activity. I have volunteers as young as 16 and as old as, I think, 86 might be our oldest volunteer. And they all have very different interests, right? And so they are not all going to want to do the same recruitment activity, or not recruitment, recognition activity, maybe, a sit down formal dinner every year. So making sure that you are, listening to the volunteers about what they want to do, who they want to interact with, whether it's, a social event that's really registered regimented or of a more free-form social event, and having options throughout the year for people to pick and choose. So I think that, yeah, the more opportunity that you provide in a variety of different mediums is going to result in more people being satisfied with what you're offering, whether that's, book clubs or movie nights or dinners, happy hours, going to baseball games, or creating, professional development opportunities. We do, I think, like a resume building offering for our younger volunteers who are looking to get into the museum field, right? And so they want to gain those skills, where some of our older volunteers, they want more of an opportunity to meet other retired folks like them who have experience 20 years in the intelligence as an intelligence officer, right? So making sure that you are providing opportunities for a variety of different wants and interests.
I would also add to that, that it's important that, trainings and retrainings, this emphasis on DEIA is not a one-off thing. You need to have a lot of repetition, and through a variety of means. As Kia mentioned, with book clubs and different conversation topics. But being really emphatic that DEII is the lens through which all of us do our work. And so, although it can be a fun activity, there's always going to be that consideration of like, who's in the room, what are we talking about, are we looking at content equitably, as opposed to equally. That I'd say is also really important, to that repetition of values, both when someone joins and being really emphatic about those values when someone's first engaging, but throughout their volunteer experience. And then I would also say empowering your existing volunteers, and specifically some of those older white volunteers, to continue their own education, provide them resources, articles to read, and opportunities to engage and ask questions. The problem historically has been white people not talking about this enough, and so making it very clear that this is not just a subject for BIPOC people to talk about, that this is a subject for all of us to talk about. It's a shared history, it's a shared problem. As Kia said, I'm Latina, but I'm a white presenting Latina. And so, there are certainly areas of discussion in which, it might not be my experience, but it is on me to continue the conversation.
One final piece I'd like to add is, I think a part of DAI that often maybe not gets overlooked, but is sometimes not considered as important, is that accessibility portion, which is something I focused on a lot over this past year. And making sure that your recognition events or offerings are also accessible to a range of different abilities, as well as interests. We have a lot of international volunteers who speak different languages where English isn't their first language. So there are going to be certain, programs that are going to be more difficult, right? Just based off of that particular criteria. We also, in our orientation trainings, talk really explicitly about universal design. And thankfully, I'm in a newer building that has taken a lot of those principles into account. So I don't struggle too much if we're doing an event on site. But if we do offer opportunities to, do a walking tour, that's going to exclude certain people, right? And so it's important to have those considerations as well when you're thinking not just about recognition, but also those trainings and even the positions that you're asking volunteers to fulfill.
Great, thank you so much. So shortly we're going to transition into our question and answer segment for the last 15 minutes. And I wanted to let everyone know that for that segment, we will stop recording, and you can feel free to unmute yourself and kind of pop into the conversation and ask your questions that way, or raise your hand, or go ahead and pop your questions into the chat, however you feel most comfortable. But before we do that, I wanted to give both of you, Kia and Mary, an opportunity to bring up anything that maybe we haven't touched on, or anything that you've been thinking of but hasn't quite fit into the conversation. So is there any last thoughts before we move into the question and answer session?
I think I just want to reiterate again that, I am not an expert in DEAI. I haven't spent my entire life's work in this subject matter, but it is something that has become very important to me, and I think that it's a lot more accessible to enter into this space than a lot of people believe it is. So I want to encourage people who think that DAI is too daunting, or I can't really succeed in all of these very complex topics, that you can and that you should try, and that there is no end game here. I think we're always going to be striving for more diversity, more equity, more inclusion, more accessibility, but it's never too late to start. And it might have felt late for me, but there's still time. So I want to kind of end on that note of positivity, but also remind everyone that I'm also new at this work.
We're all on a journey together. It's a journey, it's not a destination. I will say, so both Key and I belong to the board of directors for the American Association of Museum Volunteers, which the association just finished creating a toolkit, a diversity, equity, inclusion, and access toolkit that has a lot of breakdown of concepts, some good FAQs, as well as some actionable items to help get you started, both kind of big and small ways that you can start incorporating diversity, equity, inclusion, and access into your institution as a volunteer manager within your scope of influence. So I plug that into the chat.
Thank you so much for doing that. All right, great. So on that note, on those wonderful closing thoughts, we'll now move into our question and answer session. So we're going to stop recording.